Welcome to the Twin Bill Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Bolohan. Miguel Cabrera retired last year after an illustrious career, cementing himself as one of the greatest first basemen in history. But his 67.1 WAR places him 13th among first basemen, below the largely unknown Johnny Mize's 70.6, which comes in 11th. And when you look at the WAR of their top 7 seasons, or their peak years, Mize is only behind Lou Gehrig, Albert Pujols, and Jimmy Fox, tied with Jeff Bagwell for 4th place. So who was this Johnny Mize, and why don't we know more about him? Jerry Grillo's book, Big Cat, The Life of Baseball Hall of Famer Johnny Mize, answered these questions, shining a light on a legendary hitter who remains somehow unknown. It's a fascinating book that makes you feel like you're being let in on a baseball secret. Hope you enjoy. Welcome to the podcast, Jerry. How you doing today?
Doing great, Scott.
So the story of you writing this book, it's actually an interesting story. It started quite a while ago. Is that right?
It did. It started about 24 or so years ago, 23, 24 years ago. Yeah.
How did the initial idea come to you?
I, it's funny. I guess it's proof that baseball fans have a long attention span. I kind of came out of the birth canal as a baseball fan for some reason. I really, for a long time, grew up around a father and uncles who were big New York fans from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So I heard these stories of these characters who were like these mythological figures in my imagination. You know, DiMaggio, Jackie Robinson, Mantle Mays. I mean, these were guys they had all seen, Duke Snider and Johnny Mize, and Johnny Mize was sort of this acquired taste, this sort of a special character who arrived as a specialist, pinch hitter extraordinaire of the day. And Dad just loved the idea of this guy coming to the team as an old man and finding a last part of his career with this glorious 5-year run with the Yankees. So he was always in my mind among many other players. And then we saw him as an old timer at a baseball game, and there was, fat Johnny Mize in a 70s era Cardinals uniform stretching it. We were actually there to see Stan Musial and get his autograph, believe it or not. But Dad was excited about seeing the big cat. And you should have seen him when he was with the Yankees. Fast forward many years, and I become the editor of a newspaper here in Northeast Georgia. And it happens to be 5 miles from where Johnny Mize grew up, lived, and died. And I didn't know this at the time. I mean, I loved the area. It was beautiful. It was for the outdoors and the scenery and the Mayberry kind of newspaper life, the country editor life. And I get a call from Judy Mize, Johnny's daughter. And she had a story to pitch and, something about her dad being honored posthumously. And we hit it off. We became friends and we talked for a while, for off and on for years. And after a couple of years, maybe a year and a half or so, it got in my head that I'd like to write a book about her dad. And she loved the idea. So we sat down and did a proper interview. And I interviewed her brother over the phone briefly. And interviewed people who knew him from the local town of Demarest, where he lived, and as well as ball players who were alive at the time: Whitey Ford, Don Gutteridge, Bobby Brown, some of the legends. And what happened was I actually wrote a chapter or two and sent it off to a publisher, a fine publisher, a small press. They do a lot of baseball books. And to my surprise, got an offer from them. About a day or two later, maybe a week, my son was born prematurely by 3 months. And there were all of these different issues that sort of came to light. And he had a host of developmental disabilities. It sort of shifted my focus away from the notion of writing a book and just sort of focusing on work and family, and left the extracurricular writing for another time. And so put that project down. Years go on, and when I get to the point in my career that I have time to maybe work on a book in the evenings and on weekends, I do a music book instead, because that was where I was vibing, or my son was vibing. We were really together on that. And so Joe is also a baseball fan, and my daughter Samantha is a baseball fan. I dragged her to see Ty Cobb's grave when she was a toddler, for crying out loud. She was always on my case to, like, when are you going to write a baseball book? You did the music thing, and she edited it. And she, when are you going to do a baseball book? And I thought, I started the Mize book, and most of these people are gone now, including Judy. And I was thinking, boy, I do not want to have wasted their time. And I still love this character. And I dove back into his life and research again, got some of my old research, and really updated it because there was so much more I was able to find out. The good thing about waiting 23, 24 years to do it was I was able to find so much more cool stuff about this man, to the point that his son Jim sent me the most beautiful note about how he learned way more about his father than he ever knew. And it was just the kindest thing. It was the best review I'll ever get for, I think, any book. The interesting thing about before the internet, when people weren't as used to being discovered, easily online, you pay a subscription and you get their phone number and their personal statistics and everything, you know. Back then, you had to know somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody else, and so finding the phone number for Whitey Ford wasn't as easy, say, as it might be today. But that was a lot of fun, actually, hearing Whitey Ford say over the phone, "How'd you get this number?" That was hilarious. And when I told her who gave it to me, he's like, the writer. All right, I talked to you, and then he went on in his Bronx accent, and it was great. It was great fun, and talking with guys like Bob Bragg, the legendary St. Louis sports writer, who was gruff and didn't hold back. He liked Johnny Mize, but he did not hold back when criticizing him either. He added a good critical element to the book.
Hmm.
I didn't agree with everything Bob said, but I had the advantage of doing things that Bob couldn't do as an old man, right? I was able to, again, use the internet and get the perspective of multiple people. Bob didn't cover the Cardinals, but he remembered Mize as a boy, and he probably saw him make some stupid mistakes in the field, which he was known to do. But Bob didn't see so much of the other things that Johnny did, right? Bob allowed for all of the other things we know about Mize. He was a great hitter and quiet, sort of taciturn guy. But we had guys like this, other writers, other ball players who just sort of brought this Depression era, 40s era mentality to the interviews that I think helped the book. For me, it helped book. It helped kind of put you in that time and in that time frame, and I wanted to try to do that. I wanted it to be a little bit about his times, even though the focus is heavily on his career and his life.
Yeah. Well, here's a good segue. So it sounds like you were pretty good with timing for everything like that. Johnny Mize had pretty bad timing in his life here. He also had a pretty long road to the major leagues. How did he get from a rural town in Georgia
Yeah,
to the major leagues?
it was a long and winding road, but it's interesting. I won't I won't belabor it. He was discovered completely by accident, like so many of these guys back in the day. The stories we hear about Walter Johnson and these people who were playing in the hinterlands. Well, Johnny was a 17-year-old. He had already played several years for his local college team. It was a small private college. You could get away with hiring the big high school kid to play ball. Essentially, they were hiring him. And he did that for several years. And that earned him the opportunity to do some semi pro playing for industrial teams, including a lumber company team in Helen, Georgia, which was a forestry town at the time. It was a lumber company that was owned by a Rochester corporation named Morse Brothers. Mr. Morse was close friends with Warren Giles, who was president of the Rochester Red Wings at the time. And Morse told him about this Hulk who was in the Georgia woods hitting home runs. And Giles told Branch Rickey, who was, the Cardinals, of course, owned the Rochester Farm Club. And Branch, hearing about this behemoth, sent his brother Frank to go scout the kid, and Frank signed him on the spot for a song. And Johnny always regretted it in a way when he was older. He says, "Man, I could have made more money, and I would have got to the major league sooner." Because as we know now, the Cardinals had a what was known as the chain gang, as a farm system. It was basically players moved from side to side, for many years before they moved up, because they were so stacked for a while. When they got enough talent that they became good in the late 20s, they stayed good. They had this treasure trove of talent. Just look at first base, for example, Jim Bottomley for a while, then Ripper Collins. I mean, these were superstar sluggers. So Johnny Mize is stuck in the minor league for 6 years. He withstands near career ending injuries. Actually, he did retire for a few months before an operation saved his career. And he managed to finally make it at age 23, which was probably past the time he should. He was probably ready 2 years earlier. I think it would be safe to say he wasn't alone, though, among the Cardinals legends who sort of went through this. Some were lucky enough to really get through. I would say Enos Slaughter stands out as a gentleman who I think he was in the Cardinals system for 2 or 3 years, and then he was a major leaguer. But many, um, like Mize, and again, he was stuck behind these great first basemen, was kind of left there for a while and was trade bait, even as a minor leaguer.
We had Kevin Baker on, who wrote a great book about New York baseball, and the name Martin DeHigo pops up here as well. A fascinating character, and Johnny actually has a really unique experience with Martin. What happens there?
I think of his life as a series of baseball adventures, and that's my favorite. What happened there is first the story he told he told a writer when he was an older man. Johnny was probably 78, near the end of his life. That he was asked, "Who's the greatest player you ever saw?" And he said, "The greatest player I ever saw was a black man from Cuba. His name was Martin Diego, and I played with him one winter in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic." And Johnny said it was the winter of 1943. That's how he remembered it. And so for years, I saw that quote, sort of, and off and on, even before I wrote the book, I would see, as I would be reading, and I might see the quote in a collection somewhere. And I wondered about it, and I started looking. This was even before started writing the book. I wrote a letter to somebody who had done some research on the Negro Leagues history. And Martin Dihigo was a great Negro leaguer, in addition to being a great Latin star. Anyway, his this historian's conclusion was that Mize was either old and making it up, or that he was way off in terms of when it happened. Well, it was the second of those options. He was off by 9 years. It turned out that Johnny got roped into this winter happily with a barnstorming outfit from Richmond. It was an older player that he knew from the minor leagues who said, "Johnny, we should go down to Puerto Rico and we'll make some good money. The weather's beautiful. We'll have a great time." And so he's this open-minded kid from Appalachia who takes the boat down, and he winds up meeting the greatest players that he'd never heard of, and most Americans had never heard of: Josh Gibson, Martin Diego, Tetelo Vargas. I mean, guys who were Negro League superstars and stars of the Caribbean, and they took Mize under their wing, essentially. Diego saw him hitting home runs in Puerto Rico for his barnstorming club, and he recruited Johnny and his buddy to play for this outfit that was based in Venezuela and owned by a dictator. So, but it was a team of all stars. This was like the Steinbrenner of the Caribbean in a way, or of South America. He had assembled this team of superstars from Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican, Venezuela. I mean, Luis Aparicio Sr. was on the team. Martin Diego was essentially the player manager. He was really the leader of the team. They had a manager of the team, but Martin was certainly the guy who made out the lineup. And anyway, Johnny got to play with this guy it was probably, I would say, maybe a month, maybe 2 months off and on, but officially in a tournament in which they were being watched by the bloodthirsty Dominican dictator, Rafael Trujillo, uh, surrounded by soldiers, shooting guns in the air. And this 21-year-old kid is playing and just thrived in it. I fell in love with the story. So I just did a little digging. It didn't take as much as I feared it would. The internet, thank you very much. I was able to find a database of newspapers from the Dominican Republic and from Venezuela that talked about the blonde American who hit the beastly home runs, which is how they refer to John Mize at the time. So he has this great adventure that, because he's such a quiet man, he really is, and I mean almost pathologically quiet and taciturn. I had one guy was sort of questioning that, like, yeah, it's easy to say that. I said, well, he was, talked with his kids. That's how he was. He was like, yep, that kind of guy. He didn't talk about this stuff unless he was asked. And so even his son didn't know much about this whole adventure in the Dominican. He says he barely mentioned it. Jim told me, and so that was a true joy to. That was a real treasure to sort of work in.
So he comes up with the Cardinals, and for me, I was able to sort of put it in context because he essentially becomes Albert Pujols, more or less right off the bat. Do you think that's a fair assessment there?
That's an excellent assessment. That's a first name that comes to mind of more recent ball players. Part of me was going to say Goldschmidt, but he plays better defense than. Although when Johnny was young, he played good defense. He was criticized because he led the league in errors one year, but usually he had a pretty good. And I don't claim to understand how all of the sabermetrics work, but I trust the mathematicians who put them together. But things like range factor and his fielding, those numbers are good for him. I mean, they're among the league leaders, and he's not as slow as I had heard. He leads the league in triples. He leads the league in doubles and runs. He's a hustling guy, and he's with the Cardinals. He's very much a young Pujols. Um, great analogy. Slugger who hits for average, and he didn't strike out very much. Unlike most of the people we know of today, of course, he just didn't do it. And yeah, so that's a great analogy. That's pretty close to who he was. I've thought of a slightly older age. I would say a David Ortiz type, a Frank Thomas type.
Well, and so it's interesting because you think about now, if you have young Albert Pujols, you're in no rush to get rid of him. You want young Albert Pujols on your team, and yet he's only there for 6 seasons, I believe,
Yes.
and then he's moved. What happens there?
That the story was, at least from Mize's point of view, is whenever you argued over salary with Sam Braden, the owner of the Cardinals, and Branch Rickey, the president, that you were not long for the team. Eventually, they were going to get rid of you. And there was probably some truth to that. I mean, Branch Rickey, of course, was known for being a cheapskate. I mean, besides being one of baseball's true geniuses, I mean, let's face it. Many of the players who cursed him, I think, also out of the other side of their head, recognized him for the genius he was. But he got the better of them, and Johnny argued over salary every year, and so consequently, his days were probably numbered, and well, they were numbered. And Ricky always liked to get rid of players before they peaked, so that he could get top dollar for them, and or at least that's sort of the story, right? And of course, Branch also got a percentage of what he sold players for. Not as much as Johnny claimed. I mean, Johnny was one of many players who said he got 25%. And it was probably more like 10%, 8.5, 9 to 10%. But he got something out of it. So he definitely, and we all know Branch was famous for, I'm not working on Sundays like my mom said, but I'm going to count the receipts from Sundays. So he was a master, but he got the better of Mize in most negotiations. But I think Johnny occasionally won a few of these battles, but eventually became expendable. The Cardinals were so deep. Here's how deep they were. That first baseman that
That was
replaced
Jerry
him
Grillo. His
when he
book Big
left,
Cat: The Life of
the
Baseball
year
Hall of
after
Famer
he
Johnny
left, and this
Mize
is
is
another
out
thing
now.
that actually talk about timing goes against him. He leaves the team to go to the Giants, traded to the Giants, and the Cardinals win the World Series. They win the pennant in the World Series in '42 without him, with two first basemen who between them make like twice as many errors as Johnny did all year, can't hit half of his weight. They basically do nothing but occasionally stop throws from an incredible infield led by Marty Marion, the spark plug of that team. But they have Stan Musial. They have the best pitching staff in the world. They have Terry Moore and Enos Slaughter in the outfield. The Cardinals are stacked, so they didn't need Mize. Ricky and Braden were right about that. But what they got in return, even the players they got in return were negligible at best. The backup catcher, I think, is the only one who saw any time for the Cardinals after that. So it was just one of those sort of a deal that sort of canceled itself out, right? I mean, the Cardinals were hurt, according to Stan Musial. They were hurt. Musial's contention was that as good as the Cardinals were in the 40s, especially the mid 40s through 46, they would have been better for a much longer period of time had they kept the big cat. Musial hated that deal and talked about that for years. And in the great biography that George Vesey wrote about Stan Musial, that's a quote that from Stan's son, or no, son-in-law, who'd talk about Stan and say, "Oh yeah, he griped about that for years." So, I got to trust Stan the man on that. Johnny only could have helped a great Cardinal team be even greater, but it is what it is. It made for an interesting career for the big cat.
So he goes to the Giants. He's there for a year, and then he goes off to war. And it seems like he enjoys his time at war, maybe even a little bit too much.
Yes,
He puts on some weight there. Yeah, yeah.
yes, that's great. You remembered that. He did. He eats well. He's a bit sedentary. He's not playing 154 games a year. He's playing 60 games a year, and serving as like maybe a physical instructor or a boatsman's mate, how to get in and out of a boat or whatever easy duty that he drew. And he didn't complain. I think to his credit and to most of the people back then who served, they were willing to do what they had to do, right? I mean, it's always remarkable. I mean, no way that Mize is ever going to be in the same boat as a Feller who actually saw action, or Ted Williams who actually taught pilots during World War II was a flight instructor. But he volunteered for the Navy, knowing he was going to be drafted and not knowing exactly what would happen, but probably pretty sure, because by then it had already been established that a lot of these ball players were playing baseball on for these service teams. And yeah, he enjoys a great 3 years of baseball, puts on a lot of weight in doing so, but then he plays with 2 years in a row at what might have been the best teams in the world. For North Chicago, a naval training station, which had a terrific team, beat most of the major league teams that came to play them that year in exhibitions. Didn't beat the Negro League team that came to whip them. And then the next year he goes to Hawaii and he plays for an even better team of superstars. I think Phil Rizzuto, Pee Wee Reed, there's just a number of these legends from the 40s. And they wind up winning the World Series for the service in the Pacific. And in his last year is when he gets closest to actually serving something that would be remotely considered hard time, and that was on the island of Tinian, where the Enola Gay took off from before dropping the atomic bomb, and then of course later the Nagasaki bomb. And so Mize was there when this happened. He had certainly nothing to do with that. I think he was physical training instructor. He helped build ball fields. He helped keep the troops entertained. Essentially, did his part, such as it was, and lost a lot of weight. He worked on losing weight. So when he showed up back in '46, he was back to his playing weight. He was about 215, I think. He was back to being a sort of a muscle-bound Hulk.
So he comes back from the war. He's 33, I believe. So essentially he misses his prime. Those are generally the peak years in baseball. He misses those, and yet at age 34, he has a season for the ages. He's hitting 50 home runs. He's striking out less than 50 times. He's hitting 300 as a 34-year-old. What was his approach to hitting? How did he approach the game? Do you have any insight into that?
He was a true scientist when it came to hitting. I mean, a student and who tried to be a professor, and I think in some ways I've heard people compare him to Ted Williams in that he had this assumption that because I could do it, you should be able to do it.
Hmm.
Ted was a whole other different kettle of fish, but Johnny was a true student of hitting, like Ted. Johnny was fastidious about the bats that he used, what size they were, when to use particular sizes of bat against which pitcher. He even called his shot once. It's not ever going to be a Babe Ruth thing, but he called his shot. I think it's pretty sure it's in the book. There's a scene where where somebody had been getting him out and he changed the size of his bat or something. And and Gutteridge, I think, tells the story. And he says, watch this time, if he does this to me again, I'm going to take him out. And the pitcher, he throws the same pitch and Johnny hits it out. But he was a real student of hitting. And I know Babe Ruth said something similar, but Johnny really believed that I could have hit 400 or close to it if I didn't try to hit for power too. So he had terrific eyes. I mean, He had, I don't know what his vision was. I don't know that, like Ted, had been, I think, measured at 2010 or something. I don't know that Johnny's, at least I couldn't find it. And I looked. I think it was maybe 2020 on his draft card, but he had incredible eyes for pitches, and could see where a pitch was gonna land on his bat most of the time. And he also had the capacity to change how he approached hitting. He hit the 51 homers, struck out only 42 times. It was a weird cusp for him. It was the last year he hit 300, right? So he was still a 300 hitter. But it was also when he was still the guy who didn't strike out much, who was a control hitter, who hit line drives, who happened to have brute power. But because he was in the Polo Grounds and now shifting his swing to be able to pull a little more and take advantage, because it did take him a while. He was a guy who hits power to all fields. When he first went to the Polo Grounds, even though he contended for the home run championship in 42, he hit 20 something. It was 28, 25. He wasn't used to the Polo Grounds. He was used to playing in a ballpark in St. Louis where he hit to all fields. By the time we get to 47, he knows he can hit to right field whenever he wants. But he also still has a little bit of that singles hitter mentality. So he's able to put it all together that one year, going for power, hitting like a singles hitter and not striking out much and making contact, hitting 300 and getting on base about 380, 390. To me, that's the most remarkable. He had so many good years where he put it all together as a young guy. But I think that year just stands out as otherworldly because there have been 21,000 people who've played Major League Baseball. Nobody's ever done that. More than 50 homers, striking out less than 50 times. So, I think it's safe to say, unless robots play the game, it's not going to happen again.
You mentioned Babe Ruth there. We haven't mentioned this at all. Johnny is related to both the Babe and Ty Cobb. Did he have a relationship with them at all?
With the Babe, yes, not as much with Ty. He was a little scared of Ty, but his goes to show how sort of quiet and unassuming Mize could be when he wanted to be, right? He was blood cousins to Ty Cobb. I mean, on his father's side, on the Mize side of the family, they were they were blood relatives, maybe second or third cousins, this kind of thing. And so Johnny never acknowledged that publicly. He knew this because, I live in this part of the world, and it is very much like that. There's this, I don't know, kind of in a real nice way, this sort of manners, especially people like his. This is an old family, right? They had these manners. Well, yes sir, no ma'am, kind of deal. And he didn't acknowledge that he was cousins with Ty Cobb until Ty in the 40s, when Johnny was already a star and Ty was an old man, taps on his shoulder one day after a ball game, and there's this old man, and he says, "Hi, I understand we're cousins," and he introduces himself, says, "I know who you are," and he says, "I just didn't want to let anybody know until we acknowledge that." So he doesn't really meet Ty Cobb until the 40s, and they literally grew up within 20 miles or so, of course, at much different times. But then with Babe Ruth, Johnny's second cousin, Claire, became Babe's longtime wife. Johnny would go to New York in the 30s and 40s. He would routinely stop at what he called Cousin George's house to go have a cigar and a drink. And the Babe, I think, genuinely liked it as much as the Babe liked. I mean, I think the Babe liked everybody. It seemed like he was probably a hard guy to be really close with, but you could be convivial with. And it seemed like Mize enjoyed that favor. And so he took it kind of hard. I think when Babe died, Mize left the game early. I mean, it was an exhibition game, but he did leave early. He was kind of broken up, and he loved his cousin George. He loved his cousin Claire. I found a letter in the archives at Piedmont University, where Johnny went to school as a 15-year-old. So there's a letter there from Babe Ruth's daughter, and it was, I can't remember, I think it was written to her mother, and I don't know how Marjorie Mize, Johnny's wife, got hold of it, but there it was. And it was about how they really believed Johnny belonged in the Hall of Fame. They were like, sometimes politics gets in the way. This was so wild to see. It was very kind of eerie to see this, because I wondered, well, who did he piss off to take so long to get in the Hall of Fame, you know? But anyway, I've probably taken us off of the trail.
We're we're zigging and zagging, and it's great. We're having fun. It's fine. You know what? Let's bring it back, and we'll go back to the Hall of Fame stuff.
Yes.
But okay, he ends up on the Yankees, so all of his bad timing, it's all made up for all of a sudden because he goes on the greatest run in baseball history of winning 5 straight championships with the Yankees, and he also is somewhat unusual, I think, for players at the time, especially for superstars. He becomes a bench player, a pinch hitter. You know, he has a couple of moments where he's starting, but he's essentially a pinch hitter, specialty, kind of guy. How did he react to that? How did he handle coming from the superstardom,
Mhm.
now just becoming, a bench guy?
And he had that monster couple of years in 47 and then 48, leading the league in homers again with Ralph Kiner. And then in 49, the year he goes to the Yankees in August, he has this sudden sort of sharp dip. He's playing for Leo DeRocher on the Giants, and he's just not finding it, you know. And part of it is, I think, the chemistry. Part of it is the age. You know, Johnny had been injured earlier in his career, and he kept injuring himself, and kept playing. And so I think by the time he goes to the Yankees in 49, in some ways a happy parting. I think he expected to retire with the Giants, and I think his wife would have preferred that. He doesn't feel like he was ready to retire in 49. Maybe he was going to give it another year. But when he's traded to the Yankees, at first he's, wow, you know, well, and then he's like, I can't complain. These guys are always in the race. Of course, they hadn't won in 48, but he knew who they were. They had won previously a lot. And so, yeah, he joins this club that wins 5 championships in a row. And he's on the one hand, because he's Johnny Mize, you know, he's like, this is the greatest thing. Well, damn that George Weiss, you know, he's going to look at he's going to be the, well, it figures kind of guy. He's going to be the yes, but kind of guy. And because he was sort of a pragmatic kind of guy, but also I wouldn't say he was a Debbie Downer. He wasn't that, but he was definitely for, I want to get what I think I deserve. But those first couple of years on the Yankees, I think he was very happy because he was in a championship for the first time. Casey Stengel genuinely loved him. Casey acted like, I don't know what I'm going to do with him when he first got him, but Casey was playing it close to the vest. Casey had asked about Johnny months before. When it became obvious that Mize was trade bait, Casey asked some of his friends in the National League about Mize, and they were saying, if he's on waivers, get him, whatever it takes. He'll be, because they knew Casey Stengel wanted to be like John McGraw, using role players to augment the DiMaggios and the starters. And Mize was really like the first of those. This is Casey's first year as Yankee manager, and he establishes a trend by bringing in Mize. He and George Weiss, by bringing in John Mize in August. Mize helps them win a couple of ball games before injuring himself again, um, the last great injury. But then coming up with the big hit in the World Series to help them win a game, and which becomes Stengel's greatest memory of his first World Series. His greatest memory of the 49 season is Mize's game-winning hit in the I think it was game 3 of the 49 series. So yeah, he lands in high cotton, as they say.
We're a literary baseball journal, and there's a great little poem written about the end of his career. Your arm is gone, your legs likewise, but not your eyes, Mize, not your eyes.
Yes.
It's fantastic. And he does have a little bit of a last hurrah in that 52 World Series. He's named MVP.
That's insane. He consider he hit 4 home runs the whole season. He's not having his best year at the plate, even though again he's a part timer. He had a terrific, an almost full time year in 50. 50, you could argue, was his last year as a semi full time player. I mean, he hits like 25 homers in like 300 at bats. He's more productive than DiMaggio on that team. But then in 52, he has this renaissance in the World Series. Casey has a great other first baseman in Joe Collins, who's a hell of a fielder and a good hitter, not in Mize's category as a hitter, but a great defensive replacement, right? So these guys are sort of augmenting each other, and yeah, and Mize just has this series for the ages. He drives in, I think it's 5, 6 runs with 3 homers. He bats 400. You know, the only person who challenges him, who has a great series, is Mickey Mantle, who, some argue that Mantle could have easily won it as well. But, Mize, I think, got it deservedly. And yeah, and this is before they actually called it the MVP award. I think they called it the Babe Ruth Award or something. But
Right.
essentially,
Right.
it was the hero of the series, the MVP of the series, and he yeah, and that's his last great hurrah. He comes back one more year because of that. Really, because of that World Series, he was ready to give it up. He had been talking about hanging him up in 52 after the season he had had, and after that series, he thinks maybe I've got a little juice left, and and then he does come back and he does produce. He almost sets a pinch hitting record, I believe, and helps the team win another pennant. Doesn't have a great World Series, but becomes a great footnote in World Series history when he becomes Carl Erskine's record-setting 14th strikeout. What a weird, ironic thing for a guy who was not known for striking out.
So again, we're the Literary Baseball Journal. He wrote a book, How to Hit, and I love this, and I did not know this. His agent ghostwrites it. Murray the K, the fifth Beatle. This is your next book right here. Murray the K is a fantastic subject. You combine baseball and music.
I
That's it right there.
I think that's a great idea because Murray the K was one of those early era agents, if you will. They called them business managers at the time, right? They would basically find them deals with advertising companies, or I mean, they couldn't do jack when it came to salary with the ball club. But so so this guy would probably find deals. I think Mickey Mantle was one of his clients, I believe. Murray the K, and this is weird. I didn't know when I knew that Mize had written How to Hit because back in 2000 or 2001, when I was first started working on this, and I knew he had done the book, and his daughter lent me a copy of the book she had, and I photocopied it. Remember photocopies? I don't think that there was a camera on the phone at the time, so I photocopied most of the book, all the things I wanted anyway. So just to show you how old this went. And anyway, I was blown away by the writing. It was pretty good. Like, surely Johnny Mize didn't do this. Who's Murray Kaufman? I put the project down for years. And it wasn't until I picked it up again that I went back and looked at How to Hit Murray Kaufman's Murray the K, It's like Johnny Mize, less than 6 degrees to the Beatles. I think of him as a Forrest Gump or a Zelig of baseball. All these weird adventures that happen to him.
Definitely.
He's this quiet kind of good old boy. He's a cussed, independent, I think tolerant, especially I would say racially tolerant, humanistically tolerant Southern man who's like, I just want to get what I earned, man. And if that ain't good enough for you, I'm walking. That was kind of his attitude, and I think that's why he didn't make a whole lot of friends within the baseball fraternity. Players liked him. I mean, most of them. The younger ones, I think Mantle and Ford, they weren't so enamored with him. The older ones, like Henrik and Brown, they loved him with the Yankees. And
Mhm.
then some of the Giants, yeah, it was iffy. Some of them didn't like him because he was very much he was getting paid more than them, and he was definitely I want to hit home runs and fielding comes by that time. By the time after World War II, I think we start to see a dip in his defense, and that's another reason why, we can talk about later the Hall of Fame.
Yeah. Well, let's get there. Let's talk about the Hall of Fame. I mean, obviously, you look at his numbers. Um, you lose time to the war, which I don't think him or anyone is really upset about. They seem like that's fine, and that's
Yeah.
pretty normal. He doesn't have the landmark, 500 home runs. Yet you look at his stats, and there's no way around it. He's a legendary hitter, one of the all time great pure all around power average, on base, slugging, and maybe it's a reaction to us now valuing these stats a little bit more. But my gosh, I can't understand how this guy gets overlooked for so long. I have two theories, and perhaps you can agree or disagree. I mean, I think honestly, part of it is that he finished his career as a bench player on the Yankees
Yeah.
for those 5 years. I
Yes,
really, you know,
yes,
that makes a lot of sense to me
it
as
does.
the voters are remembering part-time player, and I guess I wouldn't say that he is adversarial with the press, but he's not necessarily given great quotes. And I think that plus the combination of the Hall of Fame changes the way it votes and things like that. What is your feel about that?
I think it's funny that you said that, Scott. I've come to believe that that those last 5 years with the Yankees are a big part of it because he was a role player. He pinch hitters don't go into the Hall of Fame. Full time superstars do. And what was forgotten was the 10 previous seasons in which he was a full time player. But I do think that's a big part. I think by the time he becomes later in his eligibility, sports writers are remembering that, right? Like, in
Hmm.
other words, I think we see maybe even a shifting of the guard, like more sports writers who are like, yeah, I remember Mize. He played in the early 50s for the Yankees. He was a good pinch hitter, but so was Gene Woodling. I'm not going to put Gene Woodling in the Hall of Fame, that kind of thing. And so I think that was part of it, definitely. And I did, and you alluded to, I think the changing of the rules changed a little bit. Like the fact that you had people saying, well, he's going to be eligible next year. He's on my ballot, kind of deal. Because when he becomes eligible for the first time, he's still the sixth all time home run hitter. All the other guys are, I by that time, in the Hall of Fame. He's a 312 lifetime hitter, and though they didn't recognize this as much, he's a 390 something on base
Yeah.
percentage lifetime. He's got 1,300 runs batted, and again, with the 3 years missing, the numbers would have been significantly higher. At least 450 homers, I think we're talking about, and maybe 1,600 RBIs, and probably a higher batting average because
Hmm.
he pads his average a little bit with 3 more years of hitting well over 300, like he was doing before the war. So all that aside, I think that the gruffness also had something to do with it. He wasn't a darling of the press. I mean, he certainly wasn't. He wasn't adversarial like Teddy Ballgame was, but
Yeah.
not putting him in the. I'm not compare apples and oranges. There's Ted Williams and Babe Ruth and those guys, and then there's another layer of Hall of Famers where Johnny
Yeah.
Mize resides, and but comfortably resides. And I do think, and I did make it a point in the book that it was sort of a recurring theme because it mattered to him. And if I'm doing a life story about this guy, I have to write about what matters to him. And for some whatever sick reason, and I'm being glib, I don't think it was sick. A lot of players are very serious about their legacy. And for Johnny Mize, that legacy meant a Hall of Fame status, right? For some people, it means different things, whatever. But for him, that's what it meant. And it did bother him. He didn't grouse about it unless asked. That's the thing. I think, you'd hear about it later on in the late 60s, by the time it's getting to be the last 5 years of his sports writer's eligibility. Then people are asking by then, other right, why don't you think? I don't know. They forgot my records. I don't know why so and so got in and I didn't. You know, um, that kind of thing. And he's certainly not the only one, but in Posnanski's chapter on Mize in the Baseball 100, which I loved, and of course I referenced in my book, and this was well known, was that Mize was unfortunate. You mentioned timing. He came along in Hall of Fame eligibility at a time when sports writers were particularly diffident.
Yeah.
They were like, "We're not going to elect you unless you hit 80 home runs a year, so that means nobody." And that's basically who they elected. Not a lot of people. I mean, right? Didn't it take DiMaggio a couple of years to get in? I think more than it should, that passed his eligibility. So that wasn't such a surprise. And as Joe points out as well, and I agree with this, Archie Vaughn's case was even worse. But they were the two. I agree that those were the two top egregious Baseball Writers Association mistakes in terms of voting was not electing Johnny Mize and Archie Vaughan. Past it really was a crime for Archie Vaughan because he was long dead and couldn't enjoy it. At least Johnny Mize was alive to enjoy it, and so I think that he got the most out of it. Even if he did whine about it or whatever, he got a good deal out of it. I think he enjoyed his years as a Hall of Famer.
So I grew up in Detroit, rooting for the Tigers, and so you hear stories about Hank Greenberg, and you start going down the list of great first basemen, and Greenberg's name pops up pretty quickly. Certainly before Mize, I think, for most people. But you look at the stats, you can make a very convincing argument that Mize was the superior player. And I think maybe because Greenberg was the centerpiece of a championship team, he did have that MVP. Maybe that's why. I don't understand how we don't think higher of Mize to this day.
You hit on something we talked earlier about what might have gone against him in the Hall of Fame, and I heard this question recently. Somebody brought this up. I think the fact that Mize played for 3 different teams in an era when ball players usually stuck with a team for their whole career. I mean, the fact that Greenberg played 1 year in Pittsburgh is an anomaly. He was screwed and that kind of thing, but he winds up helping the great Ralph Kiner. But I think that Mize, the big difference is Greenberg came across as a team man. And of course he was. He was a Greenberg man too, like most of these guys who had to stand up for themselves. He stood up for himself. He stood up for his team. He was on a great team. I mean, he was surrounded by superstars, and he was a deserved MVP, and he played left field and taught himself to do it well. So the more I've thought about it, and in my book, the argument I make is that they're like neck and neck, but Greenberg was elected 25 years ahead of Mize. So my argument is Greenberg 25 years better than Mize? I don't think so.
That was Jerry Grillo. His book, Big Cat, The Life of Baseball Hall of Famer Johnny Mize, is out now. We talk to people in and around baseball literature every week on the podcast and publish around 50 writers every year in the Twin Bill Literary Journal. You can support us on Patreon. Until next time,